Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Hope you are well today. Today we're going to be taking the question of a Patreon supporter. As you know, my Patreon supporters have priority when it comes to asking me questions, and you're very welcome to join, become a fellow Jungian existentialist, the link below. Now the question is by Mikhail. I hope that I am pronouncing his name correctly. So he's relating an experience in relation to FI users, particularly like he's an INFJ, and he has experienced, it seems, some difficulties in relationships of whatever kind with FI users, and this is what Mikhail says. He says, it's a pattern I've had for over 10 years, to the point where I'm pretty tired. I'd like to be more fully myself with them, and it seems that at some point my analytical nature, which feels playful and restful to me, is received by them as a threat, and there's a power struggle to which my FE relents, but I feel disappointed and less interested in maintaining depth of connection. Some direct feedback I've received is that, quote, logic and analysis obstruct emotional intimacy, and a quote, whereas I feel most happy, loved, and appreciated where my TI, but also a question mark in parentheses, is welcome. So we are back to the age-old question of the relationship between high FI users. So let's include the FI dominance here for starkness of presentation, so the ISFPs and the INFPs, and then high F users, so INFJs, ISFJs, but also ENFJs and ESFJs. Is a relationship possible, an emotional relationship, a good friendship, something that's, profound? And if so, how? There seemed to be so many obstacles in terms of function clashes and value clashes and temperamental oppositions and so on. Well, it's a topic that's always worth thinking about. Just before I move on, remember, I have written a book on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul. You can get it in the description box below. Check the Amazon page and all the comments to get an idea whether you'd be interested in my new novel, The Infinite Castle, also less than $10 in the description box below. Have a look. So, of course, if you have seen my videos on the 5 best best matches for INFJs, relatively controversial videos by my standards, you'll have noticed that I put INFP at number 1. I say controversial because until then I don't think my list was particularly controversial. I put ENFPs, INTPs, ENTPs in that list. But people just, there were a few who said, INFPs, that's great. But they were a relative minority. I would say the majority were a bit surprised, and they shared that although they appreciated the perspective, they couldn't really relate, and that they had difficulties with INFP. So what Mikhail is sharing in his post is something that is quite widespread, and it speaks to a wider difficulty that high F users experience with high FI users and vice versa. Now, I must have a reason for having picked INFP at number 1, a reason that hopefully transcends my personal case, because I speak sometimes about how Ireland, which is a country I joined for about 16 and a half years ago, is a country where for some reason there's a lot of high FI users, and maybe through exposure I've been able to, like a sponge, to absorb the way that they are and to get on with them better and to get the best out of them. But that would be just for extracting from my personal experience, and in some sense it would be a limiting illustration. So I do think that there is more than this, and I do maintain that there is a really great potential in a relationship between a high FI user and a high FE user. It's tempting, and it's to some extent easy to just assume that that's not the case and to not give it a chance. It's reinforced by personal experience. Mikael is speaking to the experience of probably, having been dating, experienced dating with high FI users, and what he's saying is that there is a sort of there a mismatch somewhere. There's like the connection doesn't quite actually connect, right? And he says something that I have experienced too, and so I want to lay emphasis on it. When he says that it gets to a point where his FE relents if there's a conflict, but then he ends up feeling like he's just listening to the FI user and almost acting as a counselor. I think what he's saying is that he gets peace, the absence of conflict, at the price of abandoning his own nature in a way. And so yes, he has peace, and yes, the relationship on the surface is going well, but really there is a hunger that is not satiated deep inside. So I think that's something that high FI users will experience with high FI users, and vice versa again. What I would say is that I think that for a relationship with a high FI user to work and to be fruitful, you really have to be open to exploring parts of your consciousness, parts of yourself that might be to some extent untapped at this particular point in time. Parts that are perhaps mostly unintegrated by your consciousness, in your unconscious, so to speak. Parts that are, some people would say, or would like to say, part of your shadow complex, part of your shadow personality, where these functions and traits that are highly valued by INFPs, for instance, are less likely to be valued by yourself. In fact, if they're in your shadow, they are even likely to be negatively valued, to be disvalued. And so that can create room for conflicts. What I would say is that to appreciate and find a relationship with, say, an INFP enriching, you have to be really open to a whole new way of approaching the world. It's not the case of a way of approaching the world that is different in the sense that the other person's extroverted or maybe more in the moment or maybe more practical. Like the point of view of an INFP, given their completely different function stack, it's just a new way of approaching the world, and a wholly different. There's a nice philosophical term, I think, invented originally by a French philosopher, existentialist philosopher, although I'm not sure which one. Alterity, alterity, the alter for other. The experience of alterity can be confusing and nonplussing at first. It's a bit like if you're a Christian and you experience being in a relationship with a Jew or with a Muslim or with a Buddhist. There can be something very difficult to negotiate at first, but if you manage to establish a bridge, you can only begin to imagine how much you could benefit from that. And it doesn't mean that your identity as a Christian or something else is going to dissolve. It just means that you're going to necessarily open up, become less dogmatic, whether or not you believe that you yourself are dogmatic. There is this kind of, even if you like, your conscious mind might think of itself as undogmatic, but your unconscious mind has a level of dogmaticity that will have to relax if you're, so to speak, forced in a situation where you have to discuss with someone who comes from a different world. And in some sense, the high FI users, they come from, particularly if they are also, their other functions are not functions that we INFJs value. They're going to come across as wholly other in some sense. So what do? We can reject it, we can avoid it, when I say rejected, I mean rationalize that we can't get on with them beyond a certain superficial level, or we can open up to that other side. And the fact of experiencing this sense of being a counselor, of being in some sense assailed by a point of view to which we feel like we can't offer a point of view in return, it indeed can be seen as something like a red flag, if you like, as a sign that there can't be a deep relationship here. I think it actually can be seen in a different way. It can be seen as the first step in a difficult process to embracing that other side of you. So the fact that INFPs or ISFPs can make us feel, INFJs, as if we're just in the name of diplomacy and conciliatoriness, which is dictated by by Effie, we absorb their point of view, or we open up to their point of view without feeling that like the reciprocated perspective is engaged. That's a familiar feeling, I think, to all of us who have had deep and strong relationships with high FI users. The fact is, you probably are benefiting from this, even this, what looks to you like an asymmetrical relationship. You're probably benefiting from it more than you think. It is going to do you a little violence at first, because it's not something you're familiar with. And the more you remain open to it, the more you try not to think in terms of, oh, what am I getting out of this? You just try to surrender yourself to it, even if it feels like you're just adapting to the other person. I think that if you try to not get to a point where you reject and you move on, but you just accept that that is going to be the case, at least for a while, the acceptance of these other regions that used not to be very valued and gave you the impression that you were wasting your time, I think there's a strong chance that they will become more enlightened. Or when I say enlightened, I mean spotlighted. Light literally will be cast on them, and the possibility of valuing them more will appear. And not only does that mean that it can be part of your individuating journey, your journey of individuation, where you integrate these unconscious contents, because in the sense when you're interacting with an INFP on a very regular basis and on a deep basis, you are constantly engaging with an active living embodiment of parts of your unconscious. So the journey to individuation is relevant here, and why not use this in a sense? In a non-instrumental, we're not utilizing other people, but it's an opportunity for this kind of openness that is part of the journey of individuation. But also not just that. As that happens, these contents get closer to consciousness. In other words, the shadow becomes more integrated. What happens as a result? Well, the shadow contents are more integrated, and therefore less susceptible to being the object of negative judgments, negative perceptions. And I think that what appears usually in this case is that what we used to think was a waste of time, or the other person not reciprocating, is no longer quite seen in this way. So we start to understand that the INFP or the ISFP or the high FI ENFP or ISFP, whatever the case might be, they were never just engaging in an asymmetrical relationship with us. From their perspective, the relationship was symmetrical, but it's just hard for us to appreciate that the perspective is symmetrical from their viewpoint, unless we manage to get out of our perspective a little bit. In fact, from the INFP's perspective, it might be asymmetrical from their perspective in our favor, And if they can have this process of opening up to contents that they're not usually in touch with, through us, they can also come to appreciate that from our perspective, there is a desire for symmetry, just as there is from their perspective. So if you like, the sense that there is asymmetry is not the work of either them or you intentionally. It's just that this initial conflict, if you like, confrontation between different functions that are not part of the same constellations. In our constellations, their functions are usually unconscious. In their constellations, our functions are usually unconscious. So accepting that there's going to be a little bit of conflict at first, a little bit of wondering, okay, like, where is this going? Am I their counselor? What might they feel? You know, they might not feel like they're just like, oh wow, they're my counselor, it's great. No, they might actually feel somewhat similar, but from their perspective, which is very different. The perspective steeped in alterity. So yes, it's going to do a little violence at first. The question is, are you willing to put up with it or not? There's always a risk that it doesn't pay off as well. So I can completely understand someone who would not be willing to be engaged in that journey. Someone who might have experienced years in a relationship with a high FI user, and maybe they were toxic, maybe they had a bad experience, maybe the openness wasn't on both sides. So there's always an element of risk, and you could be using your time differently, and there's no criticism to offer of that choice. Simply that in situations where it does work and where the openness happens on both sides, and when the integration of formerly unconscious contents takes place, you learn to see the world from a perspective that may never have been possible by yourself, even with the highest degree of enlightenment, and that in itself might well be worth pursuing. So a somewhat abstract response, but those were my most honest thoughts, and the thoughts that seem to be the most sincere at this particular moment in time. Okay, see you soon, guys. Talk to you soon. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.